Pastor Tim coming to you from Bend and Lomita United Methodist Churches in Central Texas. We've been doing a Bible podcast of all sorts, and we're having a general meeting of the Methodist Church. People, Methodists all over the world are coming together to talk about how the Methodist Church is organized and how it, what the rules are, how it will carry on its business. Especially in light of disaffiliation of people leaving the Methodist Church, we're talking about a new day, a new spirit that's arising. And so I thought it'd be good to talk a little bit about the history of the Methodist Church. The last podcast we talked about how the circumstances in England gave rise to the Methodists. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the founder, which is key in the Methodism, that is John Wesley. John Wesley was born in the first part of the 1700s in England to a pastor and his wife that lived in England, and he was also the grandson of a pastor from the Church of England. But his father was in Epworth, where he spent his entire career as a minister in Epworth. Now, some of the things about his upbringing I think were very interesting. One of them was that his father, Samuel Wesley, was not always the best manager of the household. And there were times in which he was arrested for his debts. And so he went to debtor's prison. And so his wife was there and by herself with her children. And so he had a very strong influence from his mother. She had, if I remember correctly, 16 children, and 11 of them actually lived to adulthood. So there was a lot of death in all families in the 1700s. In England, because they were poor health care and there was beginning to become urbanized, and a lot of death was happening. But he had a small parish. Samuel Wesley had a small parish in England, and was there's also a time in which he was a lot of hostility. He was there for a long time, and people didn't always appreciate his ministry. There's a story told about how the parsonage caught on fire, and they had to save John Wesley. He's on the upper story, and they formed a human chain to get up to him and pull him out of the fire. And his mother referred to him as a brand plucked from the fire. And there's some question about who started that fire, that it may have been some of his parishioners. So it's a much better system where you can vote on whether you have your pastor or not, instead of setting the parsonage on fire. But they felt like that's the only way to get rid of their pastor. His mother was a very strong influence in his life. She was a very disciplined woman. She had at least an hour a week that she taught each one of her children individually. They were homeschooled. And so she taught them different languages. She taught them math. She taught them English. She taught them all the literature, all the classics. And she was very particular about each one of them getting a good education. And that showed in later life of how educated her children began. But also very disciplined. She would ask them questions about how their spiritual life was. And sometimes she taught Sunday school in her home, especially when her husband was off in debtor's prison, and they had to get a substitute in the church where he was. And there's a saying that there was an observation that sometimes more people were in the parsonage being taught Sunday school by Susanna Wesley than were in the church worshiping. So she was a very intelligent woman who was a good teacher. And so John Wesley grew up under that influence. He went to Oxford where he met other people. He wanted to be serious about the faith. And so they got together a group of people that they called the Holy Club. They held each other accountable for their behavior. They held each other accountable for their scholarship. John Wesley, while he was at Oxford, learned several languages, French and German and Latin, just to name a few. So he was a very scholarly man. He ended up being one of the teachers at Oxford for a period of time. So in this Bible study, they would hold each other accountable. And they used to be called the Bible moths because they spent so much time studying Scripture. Or people would make derogatory remarks about them, that they were so methodical about their study. They were Methodist. And so that's kind of where John Wesley started, and that's where he got the idea of small groups. He had created, later on, a system of small groups for the Methodists that even to this day is copied by all sorts of denominations. They found it very informative to use his style, his organizational ability to organize spiritual growth. Well, John Wesley was a preacher in his father's church for a while, but he seemed to be called into something more. And one of the things that happened was one of the pastors that was doing a field ministry. As I said in the last video, many people were not welcome to church, and John Whitcliffe was the pastor's name. Whitfield. He was going to go to America, and so he asked John Wesley to come and preach for him in his field ministry. And John Wesley said that he was submitting himself to the most vile form of being a pastor, vile practices, and he stood as the coal miners came out of their shift and began preaching. And sometimes it got so there was as many as 5,000 coal miners would be standing there listening. It was a very productive time. Remember, they weren't even allowed in church. They were seen as kind of lower class citizens, unwashed and unwelcome. And so to have someone actually come out and preach to them about the love of God, they thought that was amazing, some even to the point of tears. But some of his fellow clergy condemned him for this. They said, you can't go out of the structure. You have to be in church to worship. And that he was just entirely too enthusiastic. He got accused of being enthusiastic and therefore not acceptable in the Church of England. And he was banned from several churches. He was even banned from his own father's church, where he had been the associate pastor and then preached later on, so that he went there and told he couldn't preach, and so he went and stood on his father's tomb because he found out that part of the plot in the churchyard was owned by the family. So they could ban him from the church, but they couldn't ban him from his own property. So he stood on the tombstone and preached. And as he preached, there was a demand for him from place to place. And so he began traveling around England, preaching wherever people would gather together. And to facilitate that, he decided to build preaching points, chapels around England. You didn't have to be a member of the Church of England. You didn't have to be allowed in that church. You didn't have to be anything. You could just come and hear John Wesley preach. And he would make a little chapel with a bedroom off the back so that he could have a place to sleep as he moved from place to place. And he began to say that he realized that he couldn't do all of it himself. And so he began to get other preachers They weren't called pastors because they were not ordained, but he would get other preachers to fill in those points, those preaching points. And some of them were women, which was kind of scandalous in that day and time, because women were not allowed to be pastors. But here they were being preachers under John Wesley. He kept a very strict control of the pastors. He would meet with them frequently and make sure that they were following the ideas that he put forth and following the practices and were the best preachers that they could be. Sometimes they would ride from place to place with him. He was said to have ridden over 250,000 miles on his horseback. So that he even had a desk that he put on the horseback, on the horse's in the saddle, so that he could read and write while he was riding and walking along. With the horses following the roads that were there, he felt he was free to do what he needed to do. He was a very disciplined man. He rose up at 5 o'clock every morning, and he said, if you're busy, you should rise up at 4 so that you can get in your prayer and Bible study. He believed that that the pastor should read 5 hours a day. So he had to get up awful early to get all that in and get your work as a pastor done. The way that he financed the chapels was another interesting part of his life. He began to sell his sermons. He would print them and sell them, and he would also write dissertations against other ideas in the church about things he disagreed with, and he would publish those. And he sold them for a penny apiece. And in doing so, he became one of the richest men in England at the time. But he gave all the money towards chapels and towards property where he could preach and where his pastors could preach. He developed for them a small group system where they had class meetings, which were fairly large, and they also had group meetings that were much smaller, and they'd meet from place to place. And there was a very strict, you had to be very committed to go to those, because you had to either John or his brother Charles, who was helping him, you had to go be interviewed by them before you were declared serious enough to be part of the group. So there was a kind of a entrance exam to make sure that you were serious about studying in the faith and living out your faith. John Wesley created that small group all over England. And the other thing that he believed is that you should be helpful to people, that you should increase and better their life. One of the things during that time, the children worked 6 days a week in factories, sometimes 12 hours a day. So you can be 7 or 8 years old and you were working long hours every day. There was no childhood. There's also no education. And so John Wesley, with others, started the Sunday school movement. The Sunday school movement was not to teach children about the Bible, teach children about Sunday school stories, as we think of it today. There were classes on Sunday to teach them how to read and write and do math, so they'd have a chance to better themselves. He also believed in providing for people's well-being. He was often seen, even in the last years of his life, when he was in his 80s, going door to door asking for money for the poor to help feed them and to help clothe them and give them a better start in life. He believed in health care. There were not much health care. It wasn't available to the common person, so he wrote a health book. It was a kind of weird practices of the 1700s, but it was a health book, and it provided something when they didn't have any other ways of doing that. So he really believed in care of the common person. One of the things that one historian said that the French Revolution was primarily about the unrest of the lower class. And England did not have a type of revolution like the French. He said because of John Wesley and the Methodists, they were able to make people feel like they were cared for and that they had a chance in life. And so it kind of turned the tide of the church. We're going to be getting into some more things about John Wesley, about what he believed and what he taught, that became the foundation. It's kind of the founding fathers and mothers of any organization. Their values and their styles get enculturated into the institution. And so John Wesley's not any different. So we'll talk about that next time. I'll see you then.